The presence of religion impacting foreign policy doesn't only happen on the ground in, say, Ethiopia. It happens actually much more powerfully here in Washington, for good and for questionable motives, right? So one of the really important human rights lobbies and efforts that's going on right now is to address what religious persecution means. That is a voice that needs to be heard in Washington, certainly, in order to be heard around the world. Now, going from that to thinking, how do people who have religious motives that are actually about cultural imperialism, right, about abstinence over condom use, how do those people then come to Washington and bring pressure to bear on the government? That's a much more subtle reality, but the whole idea that Islam is an enemy is the most convenient boogeyman one could find. And people use Islam all the time to fight this fight inside of Christianity, because there's no way quicker to whip up fear in followers than fear of a shared opponent, right? So when something happens on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, or in relation to a community center and mosque at Ground Zero, right? That is really representative of a struggle inside of Judeo-Christian culture over who's going to speak for God, liberals or conservatives. And Islam just becomes an engine by which people fight for what they want inside of religions. Same thing happens in Islam all the time, which is one reason these images are so dangerous. Because, you know, people have been asking me, well, why do they want to kill us? And I said, well, why do you want to kill them? And people say, well, I don't want to kill them. What? And well, what do they see? They see missionaries, they see soldiers, and they see Britney Spears. So it's really up to us to diversify our message from the West and make sure we are reaching people more effectively.
What should the appropriate role of religion be in informing U.S. foreign policy?
Well, one thing that's important to know is that in most of the places that I have been working over the past 7 years, the government is a joke, right? Governments are failed or weak states. National borders were superimposed colonial lines on maps arbitrarily drawn many, many years ago. So the idea of the nation state has failed in a lot of places, and so people have looked to different kinds of leadership to represent them and their interests on both a local and a global level. Many times they turn to religious leaders. So that is a reality. So how do we go from there to choosing the right religious leaders? That's far more tricky. And I guess I would just say we have to take religion more seriously and therefore devote the resources to investigating and cultivating ties with a more diverse group of leaders. And you know what? Sometimes they're going to be the wrong ones. That's just the reality of it, because they're going to be very hard to vet. Their local politics are going to be different than their global ones. But that's, I guess the essence of it is resources and respect of the fact that people do follow religious leaders the way here we follow governmental ones.
You talk a lot in the book about places where religion is a source of conflict, either between religions or within religions. But what about places where religion has been a source for peace and reconciliation?
Well, certainly in a lot of those places where there had been conflict in the name of the religion, there is now peace in the name of religion, and that's a hopeful sign. One of those places is northern Nigeria, this town of Kaduna, where a pastor and an imam worked together to really transform one of the most violent fault lines along the 10th parallel into one of the most peaceful ones. How do they do that? Community building. They do some things with former fighters, and they use the actual texts of the other one's scriptures. So first of all, to remember, these guys and many people call themselves fundamentalists. Nobody who's now preaching peace that I met has moved away from the central tenets of their beliefs or the understanding that those are the absolute and only way to reach God, right? So starting from that point, what do you do to bring peace? You bring in a third element. You bring in, say, cooking stoves. You bring in something and you go to the Christian and Muslim women and say, hey, your two communities are fighting over wood fires, right? Here are these stoves, they burn a lot less wood. Your kids are not going to have to go collect it. How can you work together to raise the money to buy this stove? So it's really through issues of mutual survival that I've seen religious conflict most effectively overcome.
How did your own personal background influence what you were looking for and how you interpreted what you saw?
So I grew up in a house where the sort of questions of faith and intellect were asked a lot. I would say that if Jesuits could have kids, that I would be a Jesuit kid. Kind of always, how does the mind work in relation to God? How do all kinds of people believe in God? And how does intelligence apply to that? So that's where I came from. And that notion very much is at the center of what sent me looking along the 10th parallel. So is the idea that people can believe in God absolutely, without necessarily being dangerous or without necessarily there being a way to explain their faith away. Because my background as a journalist is writing for, secular magazines and presses. And I would come back, since 9/11, I've come back from, many Muslim countries or places where Christianity is under siege or growing, and I would say, this is what I've seen, and my editors would say, doesn't it boil down to a matter of money? Isn't this all about power? And the answer is yes and no. So I really wrote this book to speak to that kind of readership about how is it that people come to believe God patterns every step they take. Before I began reporting the book, I started with a very specific question, which is, does fundamentalism lead to violence or not? Because in my understanding of it, intellectually, the belief that there is one and only one way to find God, and the understanding that leads immediately to an enemy, because everybody else is wrong, right? That kind of binary division between us and them, the saved and the damned, the good and the bad, the black and the white, I wondered if that was inherently violent, because you were setting yourself against another person. Now, what I found was there's no single answer to that. There's a whole group of Islamic fundamentalists who do not believe in any kind of war or politics, because there's no caliph, there's no leader right now legitimate to declare any kind of holy war or anything. So they really promote a retreat from daily life. And the same is true, obviously, on the Christian side. So I think, if what I probably took away is certainly empathy, but also, it's a hard word to use because it comes with so much baggage, but a lot of humility, I guess, because I didn't feel myself in a place to intellectually judge people's lives. Although I began thinking that I didn't even question that I would be able to sort of assess what people were up to by assessing their sociology, and in truth, I couldn't.
What surprised you the most on this journey?
What surprised me most after 7 years of traveling along the 10th parallel is how real this fault line is. I started thinking it was going to be a metaphor. I thought I would write sort of narrative travel logs about this place. It's an idea that comes out of evangelical thought as the sort of the end of the Christian world and the beginning of the Muslim world. And I had thought that was probably not the case on the ground. And what I would do is go somewhere, Nigeria, Sudan, and think, oh my gosh, this is exactly how it is on the ground. And then I'd need to go back to do archival research on whatever mission groups, because I would hear these crazy stories. Well, this man, Carl Kum, came here and he wanted to build a fault line across the 10th parallel to stop Islam from spreading south. Well, that sounded insane to me. And then I would go back and go to Harvard and dig around, and there it was Sudan United Mission. There it was absolutely true. So, yeah, that definitely surprised me, how much I could stand behind the certainty of this fault line as an actual physical and ideological entity.
A lot of times when we talk about these issues, we think of some of the big picture questions, whether or not there's a clash of civilizations, but you really chose to focus on real people in real places. Why did you think that was important to look at their experience?
I really have seen that the religious clash we're overlooking is the clash inside of religions, not the clash between them. And more, the contest over who speaks for God inside Christianity and Islam, that's the tension that's shaping the future of the world's religion.